When I was 14, my family relocated to a remote area in northern Georgia. My mom had landed a new job, and we left behind the noisy city suburbs for a slower, quieter life deep in the countryside. At first, I wasn't thrilled. The thought of leaving my friends and the life I knew filled me with dread, but my parents insisted it would be a fresh start for all of us. The new house was old, a two-story structure with peeling paint and an air of neglect. The wooden floor groaned underfoot, and the walls seemed to sigh with each gust of wind. It stood on a vast expanse of land, surrounded by dense woods that stretched endlessly into the horizon. There wasn't a single house in sight. The nearest neighbor, my mom said, was over a mile away. For the first week, life was uneventful. We unpacked, settled into our rooms, and adjusted to the strange silence that blanketed the area. At night, the quiet was almost oppressive. No distant traffic, no muffled voices, just the rustling leaves and the occasional creak of the old house. Then things began to change. Our Labrador, Max, started acting strangely. Usually calm and affectionate, he became skittish, always pacing and growling lowly. Every evening, he'd position himself by the front window, staring into the forest with his ears perked, as if listening to something we couldn't hear. By night, his barking was relentless, loud and frantic, echoing through the house and keeping us awake. At first, my parents assumed it was the new environment unsettling Max. But as the days passed, his behavior only worsened. He refused to go outside after dark and would stand stiffly, growling at even the faintest sound. My mom began muttering about wild animals, but my dad's tight-lipped expression said he was far from convinced. One morning, as my dad and I were repairing the fence at the edge of the property, we noticed someone approaching from the direction of the main road. At first, I thought it might be a delivery worker, but as the figure drew closer, I realized it was someone unfamiliar. The man looked to be in his early 60s, with thinning silver hair and skin weathered by years of hard labor in the sun. He wore an old denim jacket over a faded flannel shirt and walked with a noticeable limp. But it was his eyes that caught my attention, icy gray and unsettlingly sharp, like they missed nothing. "Morning," he called out, his gravelly voice tinged with an accent I couldn't place. He smiled, though the gesture didn't seem to reach his eyes. "Y'all must be the new folks around here." "That's right," my dad responded, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Just moved in last week. I'm Paul, and this is my son, Matt." The man nodded, his gaze briefly flicking to me before returning to my dad. "Name's Earl. I live a ways down the road. Figured I'd stop by and introduce myself." "Nice to meet you," my dad said, extending his hand. Earl shook it, but the gesture felt mechanical, too quick, too firm, as if he was mimicking politeness. His pale eyes darted around, scanning the yard with what seemed like more than casual curiosity. "You folks settling in all right?" Earl asked, his gaze lingering on our tools and the half-fixed fence. "We're getting there," my dad replied with a forced smile. "The house needs a little TLC, but it's got potential." Earl nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Finally, his eyes locked on me, and his lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Careful out here, son," he said, his tone low and oddly deliberate. "These woods can be tricky. You never know what might be lurking." His words made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end, but I didn't say anything. My dad, sensing my discomfort, quickly changed the subject, asking about nearby shops and places to buy supplies. Earl answered the questions, though his clipped sentences and careful choice of words only deepened my unease. After a few minutes, he said his goodbyes and limped back down the road, his shadow long against the gravel driveway. As soon as he was gone, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My dad must have felt it too, because he turned to me with an unusually serious expression. "Listen to me, Matt," he said in a low voice. "I don't want you talking to that man again. If you see him, you stay away. Got it?" Confused, I frowned. "Why?" He seemed okay. My dad shook his head, his jaw tightening. "There's something off about him. I don't know what it is, but I don't trust him. Promise me you'll steer clear of him." I nodded reluctantly, but my unease only grew. My dad wasn't the kind of man to spook easily, and seeing him so unnerved made me start to worry. That night, Max's barking reached a fever pitch. He paced back and forth in front of the window, his ears flattened and his hackles raised. He growled into the dark with such intensity that it made my stomach churn. Peering outside, I saw nothing, just the endless trees swaying in the breeze, their shadows twisting and writhing under the moonlight. But Max knew something was out there, and whatever it was, it terrified him. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Whenever I closed my eyes, I saw Earl's pale, calculating gaze and heard his gravelly voice repeating those chilling words, "You never know what might be lurking." I tried to reason it away, convincing myself that Earl was just an odd man, nothing more. But my dad's stern warning replayed in my head, "Stay away from him." His words were uncharacteristically sharp, and his expression was so serious it sent a chill through me. My dad was the kind of person who rarely got rattled, and his unease only amplified my own. That night, Max's barking hit a fever pitch. He darted back and forth in front of the living room window, growling at something unseen in the darkness. His tail was tucked low, his body trembling as if he was caught between the instinct to defend and the urge to flee. I crouched next to him, trying to calm him, but his gaze stayed fixed on the dense shadows of the woods. I forced myself to look outside, my breath catching as I scanned the tree line. The night was still, the moon casting long, jagged shadows, but nothing seemed out of place, no movement, no glowing eyes reflecting back. Just the swaying of branches in the breeze. Yet, the weight in my chest told me Max wasn't imagining things. Something was out there, watching. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, Earl's pale, calculating gaze seemed to bore into me, and his gravelly voice echoed in my head, "These woods can be tricky. You never know what's out there." A few nights later, as I lay in bed struggling to drift off, I heard it, whispering. At first, I thought it was the wind snaking through the cracks in the old house, but the sound grew clearer, more deliberate. My name. Someone was outside my window, whispering my name in a voice so low and rough it made my skin crawl. I froze, unable to move as fear gripped me. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, sweat beading on my forehead. I wanted to yell for my parents, but the sound caught in my throat. The whispering continued, rhythmic and insistent, each syllable laced with something dark. Gathering every ounce of courage I had, I forced myself to sit up. My hands trembled as I reached for the curtain, pulling it back just enough to peek outside. Standing in the yard, illuminated by the cold glow of the moon, was Earl. But something was wrong. His skin looked gray and ashen, stretched tightly across his gaunt face. His eyes, which had already unsettled me before, now appeared hollow and lifeless, like black pits. And his mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, wide and unnatural. He tilted his head, his neck jerking unnaturally, as though he was studying me. I wanted to scream, to wake my parents, but the terror kept me rooted in place, my breath caught in my throat. And then, just as quickly as he appeared, Earl vanished. One moment he was there, grinning in the moonlight, the next, he was gone, swallowed by the shadows of the woods. I bolted from my bed and sprinted to my parents' room, pounding on the door with all the strength I could muster. My dad opened it, bleary-eyed but instantly alert when he saw the panic on my face. "What's wrong?" he asked urgently. "It's him," I stammered, barely able to speak. He was outside. He was watching me. Without hesitation, my dad grabbed the shotgun he kept under the bed and motioned for me to stay close as he headed downstairs. We checked every door, every window, but there was no sign of Earl. The yard was empty, the woods eerily silent, but I knew what I had seen. My dad didn't say much, but the tension in his jaw and the way his knuckles whitened around the gun told me he believed me. The next day, my dad started asking around about Earl. He spoke with the few neighbors who lived miles apart, the grocer in town, and even some of his new co-workers. But the more he asked, the stranger the answers became. Nobody seemed to know who Earl was. No one matching his description had ever lived in the area, and there were no records of anyone by that name in town. It was as if Earl didn't exist. That evening, my parents sat me down. My dad's face was pale, his expression grim as he delivered the news. "We're leaving," he said firmly. "We'll start packing tomorrow." I nodded, relief and dread swirling in my chest. They didn't explain further, but I knew it was because of Earl, or whatever he was. The next few days were a blur of boxes and hurried plans, but even as we prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I glanced out the window, I half expected to see him standing there, his twisted grin waiting for me. The night before we left, I had a nightmare. Earl was standing at the foot of my bed, his face inches from mine. His breath was cold against my skin, and his voice rasped my name over and over. I woke drenched in sweat, my heart racing, and spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, too afraid to close my eyes again. The next morning, we loaded the car and drove away, leaving the house and the woods behind. As we pulled onto the main road, I looked back one last time. The house stood silent in the daylight, the trees swaying gently in the breeze, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Earl was still there, watching us leave. My dad never brought him up again, and neither did I. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, I still hear that voice in my dreams, whispering my name from the darkness. We tried to move on, leaving the unsettling memories of Earl behind, but his hollow eyes and twisted grin lingered in my thoughts like an unwelcome shadow. Some nights, when silence wrapped around the world and the darkness felt heavier, I could still hear the faint echo of his voice, whispering my name from some unseen place. Years later, when my wife, Clara, and I purchased our first home together, it felt like a new beginning. The house was a charming, two-story colonial built in the 1930s, nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The real estate agent described it as having historic character and excellent potential. Clara fell in love with it immediately, wandering through the rooms and excitedly planning how we would decorate, where we'd put a nursery, how we could transform the attic into a cozy reading nook. Her enthusiasm was contagious, and I found myself dreaming of the life we'd build there. The day we moved in was bright and warm, full of laughter as we tackled the mountain of boxes we'd accumulated. The house seemed to welcome us, each creak of the wooden floors and groan of the old pipes feeling like a friendly introduction. Its layout was quirky, with narrow hallways and unexpected storage nooks that hinted at years of stories hidden within its walls. A few days after moving in, we were exploring the upstairs when Clara noticed something odd. At the end of the hallway, behind an antique wardrobe left by the previous owners, was a door we hadn't seen before. "Did we miss this during the walkthrough?" she asked, her brow furrowed. "I don't remember it," I admitted, curiosity growing. "Maybe it's just an extra closet?" The door was small, with peeling paint and hinges rusted from years of neglect. It didn't match the rest of the house, which had been meticulously maintained, and something about it felt wrong. It took effort to push it open, the hinges groaning loudly as if in protest. Beyond the door was a narrow, dimly lit room, its air thick and stale. Dust covered every surface, and the faint scent of mildew mixed with something metallic that I couldn't quite place. A single, narrow window sat at the far end, its glass so filthy that it let in only the faintest trickle of light. "This doesn't feel right," Clara murmured, rubbing her arms as though she were suddenly cold. "Why would someone seal off this space?" I didn't have an answer. The room was nearly empty except for an old, broken chair in the corner and a small, cracked mirror hanging crookedly on the wall. Yet, the silence inside the room was heavy, almost tangible, and it made my skin crawl. "We should go," Clara said softly, her voice tight. She glanced back at the door as if she couldn't leave fast enough. I didn't argue. We closed the door behind us and tried to push the strange discovery out of our minds. But over the following weeks, the memory of that cold, musty room lingered at the edges of my thoughts, like a shadow that refused to be ignored. At first, life in the house felt idyllic. Clara and I spent our evenings cooking together, watching old movies, and talking about our future. The house seemed to hum with the promise of happy memories waiting to be made. But then, the noises started. At first, it was subtle, a faint creak in the middle of the night, as though someone were walking slowly down the hallway. I chalked it up to the house settling, or maybe an old draft slipping through the walls. But as the days went on, the sounds grew louder and more distinct. One night, I woke to the sound of deliberate footsteps outside our bedroom door. Slow, measured, and purposeful. My heart pounded as I lay there, listening, holding my breath. The steps stopped just outside the door, and the silence that followed was suffocating. The next morning, I mentioned it to Clara. She waved it off with a nervous smile. "It's probably just the house. Old places make noises, you know." I wanted to believe her, but a gnawing unease told me otherwise. The footsteps were too real, too deliberate. Something was wrong, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And then, just like before, the shadows in our home began to take on a life of their own. As days turned into weeks, the strange occurrences only intensified. The creaks and groans of the house became more distinct, more purposeful. Doors that I was certain we had locked would slowly creak open, their hinges whining in the silence. Sometimes, I would catch the faintest whisper, like someone murmuring just out of earshot, the words too soft to discern but unsettling enough to make my skin crawl. It was the room at the end of the hallway, though, that troubled me the most. Each time I passed it, an inexplicable sense of being watched would creep over me, the hair on the back of my neck prickling. That feeling of wrongness we had sensed when we first discovered the room had grown, spreading into the hallway like an unseen force. Clara, too, began to notice. Though she wouldn't admit it outright, her nervous glances toward the door and the way she hurried past it spoke volumes. At night, she curled closer to me in bed, her body tense, as though she could block out the house's eerie noises if she tried hard enough. We didn't talk about it. Neither of us wanted to give voice to the fear that was slowly taking over our lives. We told ourselves it was just the quirks of an old house, but the unspoken tension between us grew heavier with each passing day. Then, one night, everything changed. I woke to find Clara sitting bolt upright in bed, her pale face illuminated by the faint light seeping in through the curtains. Her eyes were wide with fear, and her trembling hands gripped the sheets so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. "Clara," I whispered, touching her arm gently. "What's wrong?" She didn't answer, her gaze fixed on the doorway. My heart began to race as I followed her line of sight. And then I saw it, a shadowy figure standing just outside the bedroom. It was tall and unnaturally thin, its shape barely distinguishable from the darkness that filled the hallway. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It simply stood there, watching us. My chest tightened, every instinct in my body screaming for me to run, but I couldn't move. The figure's presence was suffocating, like it was draining the air from the room. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The figure dissolved into the shadows, leaving nothing but the empty hallway behind. Clara let out a shaky breath, her body trembling as she turned to me. "Did you see it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, too stunned to speak. We spent the rest of the night sitting in bed, holding each other, our eyes fixed on the doorway, waiting for the figure to return. But the house remained silent, the hallway empty. The next morning, we made the decision we'd been avoiding. Whatever was happening in the house was beyond our understanding, beyond anything we could face. We packed a few bags and checked into a hotel, desperate to put some distance between ourselves and whatever was lurking in that house. But even away from it, the fear followed us. Every creak of the floor in the hotel, every gust of wind brushing against the windows sent us into a panic. Our nerves were frayed, and the sense of dread hung over us like a storm cloud. Determined to find answers, I tracked down the family who had sold us the house. They were an older couple who had lived there for more than 3 decades. When I asked if they had experienced anything unusual, the husband hesitated, exchanging a nervous glance with his wife. "The house has a history," he admitted, his voice tinged with regret. "We didn't think it mattered, or we would have told you." He paused, then continued, "There's a room. It was sealed off when we bought the house. The previous owner said it was just storage, but we never used it. There was something unsettling about it." A chill ran down my spine. "What happened?" I asked, barely able to get the words out. The wife spoke this time, her voice trembling. "Over the years, we had incidents. Strange sounds, shadows, things we couldn't explain. It always seemed to center around that room. Eventually, we decided to seal it off, and things calmed down for a while. But now that it's open again," her voice trailed off, her expression grim. My stomach churned as the weight of their words sank in. The room had been closed for a reason, something they had hoped to keep hidden, buried. And now, whatever it was, had been unleashed again. The room had released its hold on us, yet we knew deep down there was no escaping this confrontation. We returned to the house one final time, our hearts heavy with dread but determined to end the nightmare. The house was eerily quiet when we arrived, the air almost electric with tension. As we climbed the stairs, each step creaked beneath us, our footsteps reverberating through the empty halls like a countdown. The door to the hidden room stood slightly ajar, its shadow spilling across the floor like an unspoken invitation. I hesitated, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. Clara stood beside me, her face pale but resolute. "We have to do this," she whispered, her voice wavering but firm. I nodded, drawing in a deep breath, and pushed the door open. The room was just as we had left it, small, dark, and suffocatingly cold. But now, an oppressive presence seemed to fill the air, a tangible sense of being watched. The hair on the back of my neck prickled as my eyes scanned the dim space, and then I saw it, a figure standing in the far corner, its form barely discernible in the dim light. It didn't move or make a sound. It simply stood there, its shadowy eyes, or what passed for eyes, locked on us. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The fear rooted me to the spot, my mind racing to comprehend the impossible. But then something shifted inside me, a flicker of anger, of defiance. This thing had consumed our lives, filled our home with fear, and stolen our peace. I couldn't let it win. Taking a step forward, my voice shook as I spoke. "You don't belong here," I said, my words cutting through the silence. "This is our home. You need to leave." The figure remained motionless, but the air seemed to thicken, the atmosphere pressing down on us like an invisible weight. Clara gripped my arm, her nails digging into my skin, but I stood firm, repeating the words with more strength. "You need to leave. Now." Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the figure began to fade. It didn't vanish all at once, but instead dissolved like a shadow retreating from the light. As it disappeared, the room began to warm, the suffocating dread lifting as though a heavy fog had been burned away by sunlight. When it was finally gone, Clara exhaled a shaky breath, her body sagging with relief. I turned to her, pulling her into a tight embrace, the weight of the past weeks melting away in the safety of her arms. The room, now empty, seemed to shrink back into itself, a forgotten space in an old house. Whatever had haunted it was gone, and we had reclaimed our home. It took time to heal from the fears that had gripped us, but eventually, we found peace. The room remained, its door now firmly closed, but it was no longer a threat. It had become a reminder of what we had faced and overcome together. Occasionally, I still feel a faint chill when I pass that door, a whisper of the past lingering in the air. But it doesn't scare me anymore. It's just another part of the story we've built in this house, another chapter in the life we're creating. As for the figure, I don't know what it was or why it was there. Maybe it was tied to the room's history, or perhaps it was something beyond understanding. All I know is that it's gone. And yet, sometimes, in the stillness of the night, when the wind is quiet and the shadows stretch long, I catch myself wondering, what if it wasn't the only one? As I returned home, the sight of the front door slightly ajar made my stomach drop. For a moment, I stood frozen on the porch, staring at it, my mind racing with possibilities. Had someone broken in? Or was I simply losing track of things in my growing unease? Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. The house greeted me with an unnerving silence, the kind that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. I set the takeout bag on the kitchen counter and cautiously walked through each room. Everything seemed untouched, nothing out of place, nothing missing, but the air felt heavier, almost oppressive, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. I was about to settle in the living room when a faint noise reached my ears, a rhythmic creaking sound coming from the basement. My pulse quickened. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but it sent a chill down my spine. I hesitated at the top of the basement stairs, hand hovering over the light switch. The basement was the one part of the house I had avoided exploring. It was cold, damp, and more dungeon than storage space, with its low ceilings and exposed pipes. But the noise persisted, beckoning me. Steeling myself, I flicked on the light, the dim bulb casting long shadows down the stairs. Each step groaned under my weight, the creaking growing louder with every descent. My breath hitched as I reached the bottom and saw it, a rocking chair, tucked into the far corner, half hidden by shadows. It was old, the paint peeling and the seat sagging, but what struck me most was its familiarity. It looked exactly like the chair I had thrown out before moving in. My heart pounded as I approached, my eyes locked on the gentle back and forth motion of the chair. How did it get here? Who had brought it? And why was it rocking on its own? My trembling hand reached out, and as soon as my fingers grazed the wood, the chair stopped dead. The basement fell silent, the air thick with the cloying scent of mildew mixed with something sweet and pungent, like decaying flowers. I stumbled backward, my chest tight with fear, and bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. I locked every door and window in the house, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. That night, sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the chair rocking in the corner, its eerie motion etched into my thoughts. It was in the dead of night when the sound returned. The creaking was unmistakable, drifting up from the basement with an unnerving rhythm. My eyes snapped open, my room cloaked in darkness except for the pale moonlight spilling through the curtains. The noise was steady, deliberate. I didn't want to face whatever was down there, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. Grabbing my phone as a makeshift flashlight, I tiptoed down the hall, every nerve in my body screaming at me to turn back. When I reached the basement door, my hand trembled as I turned the knob. The creaking grew louder, echoing up the stairwell. Step by step, I descended into the dimly lit space. The air was damp, cold, and filled with a silence that felt alive. When I reached the bottom, I froze. The chair was there, just as before, but this time, it wasn't empty. An old woman sat in it. Her skin was ashen, her hair thin and tied back into a tight bun. She wore a faded dress that looked like it belonged to a different century, and her hands rested neatly in her lap. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge me, her vacant eyes staring straight ahead at something unseen. The chair rocked steadily beneath her, the creaking filling the room. My body refused to move. My mind screamed at me to run, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to look away from her. Then, as if sensing my presence, she slowly turned her head, her milky eyes locking onto mine. A wave of cold fear washed over me, paralyzing me where I stood. Her mouth moved as if to speak, but no sound came out. We remained like that for what felt like an eternity, her piercing, empty gaze pinning me in place while the chair continued its relentless motion. Then, the rocking stopped. The basement plunged into silence so thick it seemed to press against my ears. The woman was gone, vanished as if she had never been there at all. When I blinked again, the chair was empty. The old woman was gone, leaving nothing behind but the suffocating silence that pressed in from all sides. My chest heaved as I stumbled back up the stairs, my legs weak beneath me. I slammed the basement door shut and locked it, though I knew deep down that a lock wouldn't keep out whatever I had seen. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the living room, my thoughts spiraling as I tried to make sense of what had happened. But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, there was no explanation that made sense. All I knew for certain was that I wasn't alone in the house anymore. The next morning, exhaustion weighed heavily on me. My mind was a fog of fear and unanswered questions. Staying in the house felt unbearable, but I had no idea where else to go. Every creak, every shadow seemed alive, watching me. Even in the daylight, the oppressive atmosphere lingered, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Desperate for answers, I decided to dig into the home's history. I started with the previous owner, whose name was neatly printed on the deed, Eleanor Martin. She had lived in the house for over 5 decades, a widow who raised her children there and stayed long after they had grown and left. She had died in the house, alone, and her children had quickly sold the property. The more I learned about Eleanor, the more the pieces began to fall into place. The rocking chair, it had been hers, a gift from her late husband. According to the son, it had been her favorite spot, where she would spend hours reading or knitting, even after illness confined her to it. When I managed to contact him, he was hesitant at first, but eventually shared a chilling detail. "We tried to get rid of that chair after she passed," he admitted, his voice heavy with unease. "But every time we did, it would show up back in the house, no matter what we did. Eventually, we gave up and left it in the basement." A cold shiver ran down my spine. It wasn't that the chair had been brought into the house, it had never left. It had been waiting, and now, so was she. That night, I realized I couldn't go on living this way. The fear, the tension, it was consuming me. I had to confront whatever it was that lingered in the house. I waited until darkness fell and the house grew silent, then made my way to the basement one last time. My fear was almost suffocating, but I forced myself to keep moving, one trembling step at a time. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, the chair was there, just as I had expected. It was empty, but the air around it felt charged, as though something unseen was waiting. My heart pounded as I approached, the shadows stretching long and ominous across the damp walls. The chair remained still, but the air was thick with her presence, like a cold breath against the back of my neck. I swallowed hard and finally spoke, my voice trembling. "Eleanor," I said, the name barely audible in the dense quiet. "If you're here, I want you to know that this is still your home. You don't have to leave. But please, don't scare me. I'm just trying to live here, just like you did." For a moment, nothing happened. The chair didn't move, the room remained still. But the feeling of her presence grew stronger, as though she were standing right behind me. Then, without warning, the chair began to rock gently, the soft creaking sound filling the room. This time, it didn't feel threatening. It felt calm, almost soothing. The air grew colder, carrying the faint scent of perfume, old and faintly floral. I knew she was there, but I wasn't afraid anymore. I stood there for several minutes, watching as the chair swayed back and forth, the tension that had gripped me slowly ebbing away. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the rocking stopped. The room fell silent, but this time, the silence felt peaceful. A strange calm settled over me, and I knew in that moment that Eleanor was at rest. The next day, I moved the chair out of the basement and placed it by the living room window, where the sunlight could touch it. It seemed fitting, a tribute to the life she had lived and a way to honor her memory. I never saw her again, but sometimes, on quiet nights when the house is still, I hear the faint sound of the chair rocking. It's no longer a source of fear, but a reminder that Eleanor is still here, watching over the home she loved. Though the house has its shadows and its past, it's mine now. Eleanor's presence lingers, but it doesn't frighten me anymore. It's simply part of the story, a chapter in the life I'm building here. Yet, every so often, as the wind whispers through the trees and the shadows grow long, I can't help but wonder, what if she isn't the only one? For the first few days, the attic was nothing more than a storage space, a dusty, forgotten room with exposed beams and a single small window that let in just enough light to reveal the clutter left behind by the previous owners. Old furniture, faded paintings, and an assortment of odds and ends were scattered about, but I paid it little attention. I was too busy unpacking and setting up the rest of the house to give the attic much thought. That changed on the third night. I was lying in bed, just about to drift off, when a faint noise jolted me awake. At first, it was so quiet I thought I'd imagined it, but as I strained to listen, it grew louder and more distinct. A faint, persistent scratching sound, coming from above. My heart started to race. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, maybe a rat or some other small animal that had found its way in. After all, old houses like this were bound to have pests. But there was something about the sound that made my skin crawl. It felt wrong. Deliberate. The noise continued, unrelenting, and I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep unless I checked it out. Reluctantly, I got out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and made my way toward the attic stairs. The house was deathly quiet, save for the creak of the floorboards under my feet. My hand hovered over the attic door's knob as I hesitated, every instinct telling me to turn back. But I couldn't. I needed to know. The moment I opened the door, the scratching grew louder, echoing down the stairs. My heart pounded as I climbed, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the oppressive darkness. The attic felt colder than it should have, the musty air thick and heavy. I swept the light across the room, weaving through the maze of boxes and furniture, following the sound to a corner of the attic I hadn't yet explored. There, hidden behind a stack of old paintings, was a small wooden door I hadn't noticed before. The wood was warped and splintered, as if it hadn't been touched in years. The scratching was coming from behind it, faint, insistent, and unnervingly deliberate. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob and slowly turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow passage that led to a hidden room. The beam of my flashlight flickered as I stepped inside, casting long, shifting shadows across the floor. The room was tiny, barely big enough to stand in, with walls covered in faded, peeling wallpaper. The air was stifling, heavy with the sour smell of mildew and something faintly metallic. In the center of the room stood a small, decrepit bed, its sheets yellowed and stained with age. But it wasn't the bed that stopped me in my tracks, it was the figure hunched over it. A woman sat with her back to me, her skin pale and sickly, her hair matted and tangled. Her thin fingers were clawing at the wall, digging into the plaster as if trying to escape. My breath hitched, and a wave of nausea washed over me. This wasn't an animal or my imagination, this was real. I wanted to run, but my feet were frozen in place. The figure shifted, and slowly, she turned to face me. Her eyes were wild, filled with a frantic, almost feral desperation. Her face was gaunt, her hollow cheeks and cracked lips giving her an otherworldly appearance. Her unblinking eyes bored into mine, wide and glassy with a madness that chilled me to the bone. She stared at me for a moment, her chest heaving as though struggling to breathe. Then, without warning, she lunged. I stumbled backward, barely avoiding her twisted, gnarled hands as she clawed at the air. A piercing, inhuman scream tore from her throat, echoing through the attic with a ferocity that made my blood run cold. Panic surged through me as I turned and bolted, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I raced down the stairs. Her screams followed me, growing fainter with each frantic step until I reached the front door. My hands shook as I fumbled with the lock, finally wrenching the door open and bursting into the cold night air. The chill stung my skin, but I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the street, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My mind raced, trying to process what I had just seen, but it was impossible to make sense of it. The woman in the attic, who was she? How long had she been there? And why had I never noticed that hidden room before? I didn't have any answers, but one thing was clear, I couldn't go back inside. Not that night. Instead, I sat in my car, staring at the dark silhouette of the house, unable to shake the feeling that she was still up there, waiting. I couldn't shake the image of her, those wild eyes, her twisted face, the way her hands clawed at the air. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in my car, watching the house from a distance, every nerve on edge. When dawn finally broke, I called the police. I wasn't sure how to explain what had happened, but I knew I couldn't go back inside alone. When the officers arrived, I led them to the attic. My legs felt like lead as we climbed the creaking stairs, each step amplifying my dread. The house was eerily silent, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. I pointed out the hidden door, my hands trembling as I recounted what I had seen. Their skeptical glances didn't inspire confidence, but they said nothing and proceeded to open the door. The room looked exactly as I had left it, small, suffocating, and thick with the stench of mildew and decay. But she was gone. The bed remained, its sheets stained and worn, yet there was no sign of the woman. The officers searched thoroughly, sweeping every corner, but they found nothing. No evidence of anyone living there, no clues to explain what I had witnessed. One of them suggested it was likely a squatter, someone who had slipped inside unnoticed and fled when they realized I was there. But I knew better. The woman I had seen wasn't just someone who had wandered in. There was something profoundly wrong with her, something that defied logic. After a few hours, the police left, urging me to call if anything else unusual happened. Their polite dismissal stung. I could see they didn't believe me. To them, I was just a nervous homeowner, spooked by an old house with its creaks and groans. But I knew what I'd seen. And I knew, deep down, that she was still out there, somewhere. I tried to stay, convincing myself it was all in my head, a trick of exhaustion and stress. But the fear never left. Each night, as I lay in bed, I strained to hear any sound, the faintest scratch or creak. Though the house was silent, her presence felt palpable, like a shadow lingering just out of sight. Then the nightmares began. Vivid, horrifying dreams of being trapped in the attic, her gaunt face inches from mine, her hands clawing at my skin. I'd wake drenched in sweat, my heart racing, the fear clinging to me long after the dream faded. It became unbearable. The house felt like a prison, the walls closing in with each passing day. I knew I couldn't stay any longer. Within a week, I packed what I could, leaving most of my belongings behind, and moved out. I never went back. The thought of stepping foot in that house again made my stomach twist with dread. I still don't know what she was, whether she was a ghost, something tied to that cursed room, or something else entirely, something beyond explanation. All I know is that I hope she's gone. Yet, even now, in the stillness of the night, when the world is quiet, I sometimes hear faint scratching or the soft creak of a door opening in the dark. And I wonder, just for a moment, if she's still out there, waiting for someone else to find her. The tales above remind us of the unseen mysteries that can lie hidden in the shadows of our world. From the restless spirits of forgotten rooms to the unnerving encounters with eerie neighbors, these stories explore the weight of history, the fear of the unknown, and the lingering presence of unresolved pasts. Each account serves as a chilling reminder that some places, and some beings, carry secrets that defy logic and reason, secrets that demand both caution and respect. If you ever find yourself in a similar situation, where a place feels wrong or a presence unsettles you, trust your instincts. Sometimes, the unease we feel is more than just imagination, it may be a warning. Here are a few pieces of advice for navigating the unknown. Acknowledge what you feel. If a place or situation feels off, don't dismiss it outright. Pay attention to the subtle signs, unexplainable sounds, changes in your pet's behavior, or even the lingering sense of being watched. Document unusual events. Keeping a record of strange occurrences can help you make sense of what's happening and identify patterns. It can also be useful if you need to seek help or verify your experiences later. Don't isolate yourself. Share your experiences with someone you trust. Whether it's friends, family, or even professionals, having support can provide both emotional reassurance and practical solutions. Respect the unknown. If you suspect a connection to a home's history or a lingering presence, approach it with respect. Acknowledge the possibility of unresolved energies or spirits and address them with calmness, not fear or aggression. Know when to leave. If the situation escalates or becomes unbearable, prioritize your safety. It's better to leave a place that feels threatening than to stay and risk harm, emotional or physical. Above all, remember that some mysteries may never be fully understood, and that's okay. Our world is vast, with its own hidden layers and stories. Stay curious, but cautious, and always trust your gut. Every home may have its secrets, but it's up to us to decide how much we're willing to uncover. Stay safe, and remember to sleep with one eye open. You never know what, or who, might be watching.